up our study of Genesis this summer with, of course, the wonderful story of Joseph. And it is quite an important story in this book of the Bible, because it actually takes 13 chapters of Genesis out of 50. So it's over 10% of the book is dedicated to the story of Joseph. So I encourage you, there's no way your minister is going to be able to cover everything in those chapters. And you wouldn't want me to, because it would be quite a long sermon. But I really encourage you to once again, after this message, maybe read through the story of Joseph for yourself this week. I think it's a timeless story that kind of speaks still very much to us today. Mostly because it's a story of a family and their struggles in life. And of course, we have our own struggles in family and everything. It's a very timely message for me. As some of you know, that my parents are going through a divorce right now. And then much of my time this week was spent trying to wrestle through family. Wrestle through those issues of what does my future hold for my parents and my siblings, and arguing back and forth. We're not trusting each other. Very much God has me and Joseph to learn. So when you think about it, you see this in this story, you see lies. You see deception, favoritism, jealousy. You see it sometimes that maybe of a spoiled brat, adultery and lust, bitterness and envy, discord, resentment, and that good modern word, the D word, dysfunction. You would think that today's message is a reflection of some soap opera, like Days of Our Lives, and not God's chosen descendants of Abraham. These are Abraham's descendants. The chosen descendants of Abraham that are called to reveal God and be a blessing to all nations. Yeah, right. This family, if you ever wanted to have a better description of a dysfunctional family, you just don't have to look at our own modern families. Look to the Bible, at Jacob's family. The story of Joseph is a very important story as it takes up the last 13 chapters. We have to ask, why was this so important and written down for us? The Apostle Paul in Romans 15 speaks of how these stories were written down for us. They have a distinct purpose from God. He says, for everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the Scriptures and the encouragement that they provide, we might have hope. Now ask yourself today, as you think about this story, what endurance and encouragement does the story of Joseph bring to you? The first aspect of the story of Joseph is the damage of favoritism in a family. Now Jacob, Joseph's father, knew the consequences of favoritism very well in his own family, in his own upbringing. He had a twin brother, Esau, who was the favorite of his dad, Isaac. And Jacob was the favorite of his mom, Rebekah. The favoritism experienced in Jacob's childhood led him to actually stealing the birthright of his older brother, Esau, by deceiving his father. Jacob and Esau, what happened to them? They were estranged for years, each living apart with no relationship with each other. Twins, estranged for years, no relationship with each other. What does Jacob do? He continues this dysfunctional pattern in his own family. He favors his son Joseph, and it causes what? Extreme tension and resentment towards Joseph and his family. No one really benefits in the family from favoritism, do they? Joseph, the favorite, is portrayed as a spoiled brat at the beginning of the story, not forced to work in the fields like his brothers as shepherds. And he's what? He's a tattletale. No one likes a tattletale in a family, do they? Jacob might think that not making Joseph work in the fields benefits Joseph, but it actually puts a barrier between Joseph and his brothers, where there isn't any mutual respect for each other. Of course, Jacob does something more. He gives Joseph a symbol of his love for Joseph, this richly ornamental robe. The only other time this word for robe is used in the Bible is to describe the royal robes that a royalty would wear to set them apart from the average person. It's clear then to Joseph's brothers that Jacob was treating Joseph as the best of them, without Joseph ever having done anything to merit such treatment. Why can Joseph's brothers then not handle his dreams? Is it not because they have no respect for their brother Joseph, who, unlike them, he doesn't have to work hard or do anything to please their father? The brothers already resent Joseph's undeserved preferential treatment, and after Joseph's dreams of him ruling over them someday, the text says, what did it say? Hated them all the more. Strong words. Strong words. Favoritism hurts the family, and the hatred builds up until it consumes Joseph's brothers, doesn't it? Dreams in the ancient Near East were important, and they were viewed as a form of divine communication and prediction. So the brothers of Jacob would have known this, and they would have taken his dreams quite seriously. The resentment of Joseph's brothers grew so much that later in the chapter, when he comes to them, right? The brothers don't address Joseph, hey, there's our brother Joseph. What's their words? Here comes the dreamer. Here comes the dreamer. They can't even treat him as if he's their brother anymore. So what do Joseph's brothers do? They plot against him with the sole purpose. What's their purpose? They want to stop those dreams from coming true. They want to stop those dreams from coming true. Now, if we can pause a second, who gave Joseph those dreams? In their mind, they understood that those dreams were a form of divine communication, right? So, little did Joseph's brothers know that in their resentment and their hatred of their brother, they were putting their own future at risk by harming the very man who God would use to save them in the future. When Jesus was dying on the cross, remember what he said to the very people whose jealousy and resentment of him caused them to actually crucify him? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they are doing. Who is there in the midst of Joseph's brothers' hatred and dysfunction, carrying out a plan of salvation? God. Who was there in the midst of their hatred and resentment towards Jesus, carrying out a plan of salvation? God. Who is there when our families and are so dysfunctional that they fail us? God. God is behind the scenes of this story, weaving and working to redeem people whose own dysfunction threatens to self-destruct their lives. Who had a plan for Joseph to go to Egypt and gave him dreams that one day all his family will bow down to him over grain being gathered in the field? Whose promise to Father Abraham that his descendants would be like stars in the sky, as Joseph dreamed of his fellow stars bowing down to him? Who had Joseph wander the fields near Shechem with a strange man knowing where his brothers had gone, so that Joseph arrived at his brothers at just the time when some Midian merchants were traveling to Egypt? who had Joseph sold into slavery to the captain of Pharaoh's guard and blessed him eventually because of Joseph? Who watched over Joseph even when he was wrongly later accused of adultery by sending Joseph's Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker to the same prison that Joseph was in? Who gave Joseph the ability to interpret dreams that would eventually save Egypt and all the Near East from famine? Joseph, in his own words, came to realize that though, yes, his family had failed him, but God was with him and was accomplishing a greater plan of salvation that Joseph could never have dreamed or imagined on his own. Joseph said to Pharaoh, when he was asked about his own dream and that whether Joseph could interpret it, he says, "I cannot interpret your dream, Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh what he desires." Pharaoh saw God's Spirit in Joseph. And then what did he do? He put him in charge of all of Egypt. When Joseph's first son was born, he named him Manasseh. And it says, because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. Joseph named his second son Ephraim. And it says, because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. So there's much behind the scenes irony in Joseph's story that needs to be mentioned. After Joseph's brothers threw him into the pit, what did they do? They had a meal together while Joseph was stuck in the dried up cistern. The next time all the brothers had a meal together was when Joseph was second in command in Egypt. And the brothers were Joseph's guests in his lavish estate, where Joseph finally revealed his true identities to his brothers. What irony. Joseph was 17 years old when his father Jacob lost him. Jacob spent the last 17 years of his life in Egypt with Joseph. The irony of all is expressed in Joseph's own words to his brothers after Jacob's death. He says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." It was God who worked in Joseph to change him from that spoiled boy into a wise leader, serving and pointing multiple generations of people to the God who accomplishes his plan of saving many lives. What do we do when our families fail us? Do we trust in God's love for us and believe that God will meet the deep needs left vacant by our dysfunctional families? The family we truly long for, I believe, is the family who does understand God as a God of grace and that works salvation for us in spite of our own dysfunction. Families that know God's grace and extend this grace to each other are the ones that God can use to save many generations of lives. Joseph lost his family at age 17, and it wasn't until he was around 40 years old that God's plans for Joseph in those dreams were to come true. During those 23 years away from his family, his country, anything he knew, Joseph had no choice but to learn to trust in God's love for him. That's a long time, isn't it? That's a long time of waiting. I wonder if Joseph ever really thought that he would ever see his family again, let alone have them come to Egypt to be with him. His trust that God was with him and that God would provide for him and in God's plan was his only hope. And it is ours as well. I want to pray today, in closing, for our families. That we need, a lot of times, we need God to bring reconciliation in our families. And to God to work in spite of our families at times. Before, I just want you to take a moment of silence before I pray, just to think of someone in your family that maybe you feel God is just placing on your heart to pray for, that God would be with. I wonder if Joseph's brothers ever got to the place, it seemed that they reconciled with Joseph after all those years, but ever really I think they also regretted what they had done, but prayed for Joseph. And maybe Joseph prayed for them over time too. But God is a God who can work in our midst of our dysfunction. And his prayer, even over those who caused his death by jealousy, was forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. So let's spend a moment of silence, and then I'll pray. Lord, in your word, it says you place the lonely in families. Yet you know how much our families are full of dysfunction. Lord, will you shower us with your love, and then so that we can share it with each other. Fill our homes and our church family with deep compassion for one another, as we hear and receive the words of Jesus for our own lives. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Lord, we see the reconciliation and hope that happened in Joseph's life. We trust that you will work out your plan of salvation in our own family. Lord, we place our families this day at the foot of the cross, ready to praise you for the work of salvation that you have brought forth from our dysfunction. God, who created the family, we look to you because even when our family fails, your love never fails. Amen.